Dry brushing is using the brushes or the applicator, but only doing a light touch with the tips of the bristles and only the lightest amount of paint. So you load up the brush with paint, you don't really dip it in a whole lot. You just get some on the tips, you may wipe off excess, and then you just do a light brushing action to just put some paint on the surface of your material, not covering it up entirely, but either using your brush technique or your applicator technique to create the effect, or taking advantage of the inherent variations in the surface of the material to let the paint pick up the high mountainous points of the surface. If it's a brick or a rock or a stubbly texture or a popcorn texture, the dry brush is going to put that paint on the little peaks that are in the material, and that's going to make those little peaks pop out from the paint that's in the little valleys of the material. You can dry brush with a paintbrush, you can dry brush with rollers, you can dry brush with anything. It's just a term for a light application of paint on top of a surface that's meant to be irregular and not cover up or opaquely cover. It's a little similar to spattering, except it's going to have, the spattering is going to be a bunch of little dots, and the dry brush is going to be either a technique that's related to the brush you're using, or it's going to be inherent to the varied texture of the material that you're painting on. I recommend that you take your paint, and when you have your brush loaded, that you kind of practice on another material so you can kind of get a sense for what the dry brushing might actually look like, because we don't want to be this solid, we want to be more of a light dusting. So this is better. This is a very light dry brushing. You can vary from here to a more heavy dry brushing. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but this is just to demonstrate the basic principles of dry brushing and how you can use that as an added layer to create aging. You can accentuate depth of your material if it has a lot of variations of rocky, bumpy texture, styrofoam, again, popcorn texture like a popcorn ceiling. If you have the orange peel walls, like you have that type texture in some apartments, this will put paint on the highlights and accentuate those little orange peel variations. It's either a good approach to paint over textured material, physically textured material. We call all of our scene paint methods texture painting, but it's texture painting is creating texture with paint as opposed to physical texture of the material itself. Or you can use the brush strokes themselves to create the dry brush stroke in your material. Let's see if I can do something like that. Be a little heavier. It's a little heavier, and the paint surface I've got has a lot of peeled and sanded paint, so there's a lot of divots, so it's picking that up here. You don't really have a smooth surface to paint on. If I were to use my scrap wood as my surface. This is also picking up the texture of the wood itself, because the wood has that vertical grain. That's dry brushing. This is one possible application of dry brushing. This is a sample from a show we did several years ago, and there's a dry brushing top coat here that's intended to be a wood grain type of feel. Again, not 100% realistic wood graining, not trying to create a specific type of lumber, whether it's oak or walnut or cherry or mahogany or some other exotic species. It was just by the designer's choice to use specific range of colors for planks and specific range of colors for a dry brush top coat. So in this particular plank, there's a red-brown base coat and a dark brown dry brush. In this one, it's sort of a mustard yellow base coat and a red-brown dry brush, a little different color red-brown than this dark background. This was a brighter yellow, still mustard. I would still call this this would be a brighter mustard yellow versus a darker mustard yellow with a red coat. It might actually be the same red-brown coat as that one, but it creates linear strokes and a nice steady hand and even brush stroke, and actually somewhat even brush stroke because you've got points where it's darker and points where it's lighter. So you lift that brush up and down a little bit and apply varying levels of pressure, and you get variations, intentional variations like that. This one does have a very defined brush stroke right here, and that probably we wanted to avoid. But other than that, it's very, very effective. I'm going to demonstrate 3 or 4 different tools, dry brushing technique, and you can use a lot more than the ones I demonstrate, but it's just a sampling of how the different tools behave differently with dry brushing. I'm going to use the back of this panel to get the excess paint off of my brush or material before I do the dry brush so I can get it to the right consistency. The paint consistency can vary. Just know that the thicker paint is probably going to be a little bit easier to dry brush and do a light coat. So you kind of want it to be maybe a little thicker than your standard 2-to-1 mixture. You can use any paint water mixture depending on the effect that you're going to do. This is a little watery, so I've got to get a lot of the paint out of my brush. And again, I've got a smooth surface, so I'm going to do some linear strokes. Now I can also pick up some of this paint that I put on my sample. I don't have to keep dipping it. There we go. So the size of my brush is going to determine the size of my stroke. And since this is fairly watered down, it's going to go on translucent. We're just defaulting to a kind of a wood grain stroke. That's not the only option, but it's the most obvious one with a brush, and that's fairly linear lines. Same thing with a bigger brush. These chip brushes just don't hold a lot of paint, so that's going to affect my application. And this can start to look like the combing technique, because some of the bristles are applying more paint than others. But it's not the combing technique because the brush isn't cut into little combing strips. So using the same little 1-inch brush here, Get some of that off. And the thicker paint leaves more of that erratic dry brush feel, as opposed to the watery paint leaves more of a streak. But it's still considered a dry brush because your brush is largely not soaking wet, and you're not trying to do full coverage, and you're not wet blending multiple colors. You're putting a paint on top of an already painted surface that's already dry. I wanted to try our flogger brush or our dragging brush. See if there's a difference there. It's kind of, I didn't let it dry properly, so it's kind of got this bend in the brush. That's why you always want to hang your brushes up to dry. You don't want to set them down on this, and you don't want to set them on their side where something's going to prop up to them and do something weird. I'm expecting the flogging brush to actually do a really nice job. That's probably the brush that was used on that scenic panel, because you get a lot of flex in the bristles, and that allows you for a lot more subtle control of pressure. But we could do the same thing with the 4-inch standard paintbrush. There's not much paint in there. So the stiffer brush is allowing me to get a more consistent pressure and a more consistent lay of the brush, as opposed to the more varied. So a lot of choices to make. You can dry brush with a sponge. That's okay. Dry brushing doesn't require a brush. It can be any material. My sponge is a little too wet because it was dry, so I dipped it in the water. There we go. Little different texture. And because my sponge is wet, it's turning into a wiped on glaze, actually, which wasn't 100% the intention. Let's try a completely dry sponge without that extra added water. I'm going to do something very similar. But at least with the drier sponge, I can get a little bit more of a dragging, streaking motion. Trying to get more paint saturated into my sponge. Wet sponge, dry sponge, and of course we can dry brush with rollers of various types. I'm going to need some paint on a material here. I didn't bring a roller tray, so I'm just going to dribble some on the back here, get my roller soaked. So a dry brush is actually what's happening when you're getting towards the end of your roller is you're trying to squeeze more paint out and you need to reload your brush. That's where you want to be if you're going to do a dry brush with a roller. So you just want to put some light dry brushing. And again, pressure and how well saturated your roller is going to have a great deal of effect. This is your standard roller. Here we have a textured roller, and this will do a little different texture on our dry brush technique. It will get us a little more random here. Good for foliage, good for rock textures, if we have a smooth surface. So a lot of different ways to do your dry brushing and a lot of different tools and applications. Dry brushing with the texture roller, dry brushing with a standard roller, dry brushing with a dry sponge, dry brushing with a wet sponge, dry brushing with a standard 4-inch household paintbrush, dry brushing with a longer bristle flogger or dragging brush, and dry brushing with a more watery paint and more of a dry brush glaze. And specific range of colors for a dry brush top coat. And hello Cheesy, kitty approved. But all we have here is, this is a brown, a reddish brown base coat with a dark brown dry brush. The reddish brown base coat is put on Cheesy! You gotta go now. You go now. Oh, baby. Come on, let me love you up. Let me love you up, Cheesy. So in this particular plank, there's a red-brown base coat and a dark brown dry brush. In this one, it's sort of a mustard yellow base coat and a red-brown dry brush, a little different color red-brown than this dark. I'm going to demonstrate three or four different, Cheesy.